Officer had spent 7 incredible years with King, his German Shepherd partner, and their connection was legendary throughout the Memphis Police Department. But the story of how they came together was just as remarkable as their partnership itself. Had always believed in second chances, a philosophy that had guided him through his 23 years of law enforcement. When King was first assigned to him, the dog was considered difficult, unpredictable, and potentially unsuitable for active duty. King had washed out of 3 different training programs, and there were serious discussions about whether he should be retired before his career even truly began. But saw something in King's eyes that others had missed, not aggression or instability, but fear, trauma from a previous handler who'd been too harsh, too demanding. Took it upon himself to rehabilitate the dog, spending countless hours after his shifts working with King in the training yard, speaking to him in soft tones, rebuilding his trust in humanity. The transformation was gradual but undeniable. Within months, King had become not just a functional police dog but an exceptional one. He had developed a telepathic understanding, a synchronization that made them nearly perfect partners. Every morning would stop at the same coffee shop on street where the barista, a woman named, knew his order by heart: black coffee, 2 sugars, and an extra-large croissant. Without fail, would also prepare a specially ordered dog treat for King, chicken and sweet potato biscuits baked fresh that morning by her brother. Would hand King the treat through the cruiser window, and King would devour it with grateful intensity, his tail wagging so hard it seemed his entire back half might detach. Would laugh every single time, commenting that she'd never seen a dog so happy about a breakfast snack. This ritual became sacred, a small moment of normalcy and joy in a job that often involved chaos and danger. The true magic of and King's bond became evident in their home life. 8-year-old Sophie's daughter would race to the front window whenever she heard the distinctive rumble of her father's police cruiser pulling into the driveway. Her mother, Jennifer, would smile knowingly from wherever she was in the house, setting down whatever task she was doing because she knew what came next. King would leap from the vehicle with the energy of 1,000 suns, his tongue hanging out, his entire body vibrating with excitement. But here's what most people didn't understand. King's enthusiasm wasn't primarily directed at. The dog had learned through hundreds of homecomings that Sophie represented pure, unconditional joy. She would race down the front steps, and King would meet her halfway up the driveway, his massive frame somehow gentle as he pressed his head against her small body. Sophie would wrap her arms around his neck, and for a few perfect seconds, the world would stop. What made King truly extraordinary wasn't just his police work, though that was impressive. The dog had saved life 3 documented times. The first incident occurred during a drug raid when a suspect pulled a concealed knife from his jacket. King's instincts kicked in before even registered the threat, and the dog tackled the suspect with precision, disarming him before anyone was hurt. The second time came during a nighttime pursuit when a criminal hid in an abandoned warehouse, attempting to ambush. King's acute senses detected the threat, and his alert bark gave the seconds he needed to take defensive positioning. The third incident was perhaps the most dramatic. King had detected an active fire during a building investigation and had physically pulled away from a collapsing ceiling just moments before it crashed to the floor. Each of these moments had been documented in official reports, and King had received commendations that were framed on the wall of the Memphis Police Department's K-9 unit. But what nobody outside the family truly understood was that King had an even greater gift than his police work. He possessed an almost supernatural ability to understand human emotion. Whenever Sophie had a bad day at school, when she came home quiet and withdrawn after a conflict with classmates or a disappointing test grade, King would somehow know. He wouldn't greet her with his usual boisterous enthusiasm. Instead, he would follow her to her room, gently push his way into her space, and simply rest his large head on her lap. He would remain there, motionless and present, until Sophie's tears stopped and her breathing steadied. Jennifer had watched this phenomenon countless times, and had come to believe that King possessed some kind of empathetic radar that allowed him to sense Sophie's emotional state before anyone else could. Often joked that King was a better therapist than the department's official counselor, and there was truth hidden in that humor. The dog had helped Sophie navigate the complexities of childhood, the social anxieties, the academic pressures, the small traumas that every child experiences. When Sophie's best friend moved away in third grade, it was King who sat with her through the entire night, allowing her to cry, to grieve, to process the loss of a friendship that had felt permanent to her young mind. When Sophie struggled with her reading skills and felt embarrassed in front of her classmates, it was King who reminded her that she was worthy of love and acceptance exactly as she was. Their family dinners were incomplete without King's presence beneath the table. Had established a rule early on that King was part of the family unit and would participate in family meals, though he was never fed from the table, a boundary maintained with consistent discipline. The dinner table became the heart of the household, would share stories about his day on the force, carefully editing them to be appropriate for an 8-year-old's ears. He would talk about the communities they served, the people they helped, and the importance of integrity and courage. Jennifer would share stories about her work as a school administrator, discussing the challenges and triumphs of working with young people. Sophie would share her observations about life, her questions about the world, her dreams about her future. And King would lie beneath the table, his presence a comforting weight, his occasional yawn or shift in position a reminder that even in serious conversations, there was something grounding and real about being in the presence of a being who loved without conditions or judgment. Sophie had created an entire mythology around her father and King in her child's imagination. She believed they were superheroes working in the real world, fighting crime and injustice, protecting the innocent from danger. She drew pictures of them in her school art class, with a blue cape, King with a golden shield on his chest. Her teacher had displayed these drawings on the classroom wall, and Sophie had felt a swelling pride, knowing that her father and King were recognized as heroes not just in her heart, but in her community and her school. She had no idea, in these golden moments of childhood security, that one decision, one split-second choice made by a desperate person in the darkness of a February night, would shatter everything she held dear and transform her entire understanding of what heroes were and what they sacrificed. The evening of February 14th began like any other Tuesday night. Sophie had spent the entire school day working on a Valentine's card for her father, cutting out construction paper hearts, carefully writing, "I love you, Dad," in her best first-grade cursive, even though she was now in third grade and could write much more sophistication. She decorated the edges with drawings of King's face, capturing his distinctive markings, the alert expression of his dark eyes. She'd made a separate card for King too, drawing himself and Sophie together with hearts floating between them. Her mother had helped her bake chocolate chip cookies, her father's favorite, and they sat cooling on the kitchen counter as the afternoon turned golden and then gray with approaching evening. Sophie had placed both cards and a plate of the best-looking cookies on the kitchen table, anticipating her father's arrival home, imagining the way his face would light up, the way he would sweep her into a hug, and tell her she was the best daughter in the entire world. February 14th started like any other Valentine's Day, though in the household it held special significance. Had arranged to work the evening shift so that he could spend the morning and early afternoon with his family. He'd taken Sophie and Jennifer out for an early lunch at her favorite Italian restaurant, where Sophie had ordered spaghetti and meatballs, getting red sauce all over her face and giggling uncontrollably as her father gently wiped her chin with a napkin. They'd gone to a local ice cream parlor afterward, where Sophie chose mint chocolate chip and sat between her parents in a booth, swinging her legs contentedly. Had given Jennifer a beautiful diamond bracelet that morning, wrapped in elegant silver paper, and she'd kissed him deeply, whispering that she loved him more than she could ever express. Sophie had presented her handmade cards with solemn ceremony, and had made a show of reading them multiple times, telling Sophie that her artwork was gallery quality and that she should consider a career as an artist. He'd carefully placed both cards on the mantelpiece in the living room, positioning them where they would catch the light. By 5 o'clock in the evening was preparing for his shift. He showered, shaved, and dressed in his uniform with the careful precision he always employed. Sophie watched from the bedroom doorway as her father checked his equipment, his badge, his duty belt with its various attachments, his service weapon. She'd seen this ritual 1,000 times, and it had never frightened her. It was simply what her father did. It was part of the fabric of her understanding of who he was. What she didn't comprehend was the statistical reality that her father faced every single shift, the danger that lurked in the shadows of the city, the violence that could erupt without warning, the possibility that this goodbye might be the last one. Knelt down and pulled Sophie into a tight embrace, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo, committing the feeling of her small frame against his chest to memory in a way he did every night, though he didn't consciously realize it. "Be good for your mom," he told her, his voice soft and full of love. "And tell King to be a good boy too. I'll see you in the morning, okay?" Sophie nodded, her small hand reaching up to touch his face. "Dad, be careful," she said, the way children do when they sense something larger than themselves, some intuitive warning that they can't quite articulate. "Always careful," promised, and he meant it. He'd promised this 1,000 nights before, and he'd kept that promise every single time. King was already waiting by the front door when came down, his leash in hand, his body trembling with the anticipation that came with the evening shift. The dog understood the rhythms and rituals as well as any human. He knew that the uniform meant work, meant adventure, meant the streets of Memphis and the partnership that defined his existence. Clipped the leash to King's collar and scratched behind his ears, speaking to the dog in the low, affectionate tones that only they seemed to understand. "Let's go to work, partner," said, and King responded with a sharp bark of agreement. The evening shift began like any other, and King responded to a shoplifting call at a convenience store on Summer Avenue, where they apprehended a teenager with a backpack full of stolen merchandise. They broke up a noisy party on Madison Avenue where neighbors had complained about excessive noise. They investigated a traffic accident on Poplar Avenue, ensuring that everyone involved received appropriate medical attention and that the necessary reports were filed. By 10 o'clock, it had been a routine night, quiet, manageable, the kind of shift that allowed to complete paperwork and think about getting home to Sophie and Jennifer, about sleeping in a warm bed, about the simple pleasures of family life. At 10:47 p.m., the dispatch came through. A domestic violence call in East Memphis, an address in a neighborhood that had been struggling with crime and poverty for decades. The call came from a neighbor who'd heard screaming and the sounds of things breaking, acknowledged the dispatch and headed toward the location, King alert and ready in the back of the cruiser. Neither of them could have known that this call would be different from all the others. Neither of them could have known that this night would change everything. When arrived at the modest apartment complex, he could hear the commotion even from outside. A woman was screaming and there were sounds of violence, a man's angry voice, the crash of furniture being overturned. Drew his service weapon and approached cautiously, as he'd been trained to do hundreds of times. He knocked on the door and announced himself, identifying himself as a police officer. The door swung open, and what happened next occurred in seconds but would echo across eternity. The man who opened the door was named, a 43-year-old with a history of drug addiction, violence, and multiple arrests. He was high on methamphetamine, his pupils dilated to the size of saucers, his body vibrating with drug-fueled adrenaline and rage. Behind him on the floor was a woman with blood on her face, terror in her eyes. She was screaming, "He has a gun! He has a gun!" What happened next would be investigated by multiple agencies, analyzed in reports that would gather dust in filing cabinets, discussed in police academy training rooms for years to come. Didn't make a rational decision. He didn't think through consequences. The methamphetamine coursing through his system had stripped away his capacity for reason. He reached into his waistband and pulled out an illegal handgun, a 9 that had been stolen from a pawn shop 3 months earlier. Saw the weapon and began to raise his own gun in defensive response, but didn't give him the opportunity to complete that action. Fired 3 times in rapid succession. The sound was deafening in the confined space of the apartment. The first bullet pierced shoulder. The second entered his abdomen. The third caught him in the chest near his heart. Fell backward, his service weapon clattering to the floor. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, a white-hot agony that consumed his entire consciousness. He gasped for breath, but it came difficult, as if his lungs weren't receiving the signal to inflate. King, from his position in the police cruiser outside, heard the shots. The sound of gunfire was something he'd been trained to recognize, and his response was instantaneous. He howled, not the alert bark of a working dog, but a sound of pure anguish and rage. He threw himself against the cruiser windows, scratching desperately at the glass, his nails breaking against the resistant surface. The howl continued, a primal sound that echoed through the apartment complex and into the night, a sound that would haunt the neighborhood for weeks to come. Officers responding to the backup call arrived within minutes. They found standing in the doorway, guns still in hand, apparently uncertain about what came next. They quickly subdued him, took him into custody. But by then it was too late. Lay on the floor, blood pooling beneath him. The female victim, the woman who'd called for help, was sobbing uncontrollably, traumatized by what she'd witnessed. Paramedics arrived with sirens wailing, rushing into the apartment, immediately beginning CPR, inserting IV lines, administering medications designed to keep alive long enough to reach the hospital. The drive to Memphis Regional Medical Center took 9 minutes. The trauma surgeons were standing by, having been alerted by the paramedics about the nature of the injuries. They worked for 4 hours, trying desperately to reverse the damage, to stitch together organs and blood vessels and tissue. They called in specialists. They used every technique available to them. They prayed, though prayer isn't technically allowed in operating rooms, but injuries were simply too severe. His heart, punctured by the bullet, had sustained damage that surgery couldn't repair. His abdomen had filled with blood, and despite their best efforts, the surgeons couldn't stop the bleeding. At 11:47 p.m., less than an hour after the gunshots had rung out in that apartment, the trauma team ceased their efforts. The monitor above's bed went flat, the steady beep becoming a single, final tone. Officer, 23-year veteran of the Memphis Police Department, beloved husband, devoted father, extraordinary human being, was pronounced dead. The Memphis Police Department's radio fell silent for 60 seconds, a tribute officers give only to their fallen brothers and sisters, a moment of collective grief and respect that permeates through every precinct in the city and beyond. Officers who were on break stood up. Officers who were in the middle of arrests paused. Dispatchers fell quiet. For 1 full minute, the radio that typically crackled with constant communication remained silent, a void that represented the permanence of loss. Sophie was home, watching Valentine's movies with her mother when the knock came on the door at 12:15 a.m. Jennifer opened the door to find 2 police officers in uniform, their faces grave, their posture communicating something before they even spoke. She knew. Mothers know. Some part of her had been waiting for this knock her entire marriage, a fear she'd never fully articulated. The world as she and Sophie knew it ended in that terrible moment. The morning after Officer's funeral was bitterly cold, with a gray sky that seemed to match the collective mood of the Memphis Police Department. Hundreds of officers had attended the funeral, coming from precincts across the state and even neighboring states. The Memphis Police Department had organized a full ceremonial funeral befitting officer, years of service and sacrifice. There had been a procession through downtown Memphis, with traffic stopped by uniformed officers standing at attention, with bagpipes playing Amazing Grace, with Sophie, dressed in a black dress 2 sizes too large, walking between her mother and her maternal grandmother. Sophie hadn't cried at the funeral. She'd seemed to exist in a state of shock, her eyes vacant, her movements mechanical. She'd stared at the American flag-draped casket, unable to fully comprehend that her father was actually inside it, that she would never hear his voice again, never feel his embrace, never have him tuck her into bed at night. King had not been at the funeral. The dog remained at the Memphis Police Department's K-9 training facility and kennels, a sprawling compound on the outskirts of the city, where the department trained new K-9 units and housed the dogs when they weren't actively working. The facility was run by Captain David, a gruff, efficient man who had been working with police dogs for 32 years and believed that emotion had no place in professional decision-making. Was the one who made the call that morning, a call that would set everything else in motion, a decision that seemed logical and correct according to the protocols and procedures that had been established decades ago. King had been retrieved from the scene of death by Officer James, no relation to the perpetrator, who was the second K-9 handler on duty that night, had found King still in the police cruiser, scratching frantically at the windows, his fur matted with his own saliva, his eyes wild with confusion and distress. Had managed to calm King enough to get him into his own cruiser, speaking in soothing tones, though his own hands were shaking from the adrenaline and shock of what had happened. He'd driven King directly to the facility rather than to his own home, knowing that the dog needed professional evaluation and care. When Captain arrived at the facility the next morning, he found King in one of the kennels, sitting motionless in the corner. The dog had not eaten since arriving at the facility. His water bowl remained full. He refused to engage with the toys that were provided to him. When approached the kennel, King didn't move, didn't acknowledge the captain's presence. It was as if the dog had checked out of the world, as if the part of him that made him King, the vibrant, energetic, intelligent dog, had simply ceased to exist. Called in Dr. Williams, the department's veterinarian, to examine King and provide a professional assessment. Dr. Williams had been working with police K-9 units for 18 years and had seen this phenomenon before. She conducted a thorough physical examination and found King to be in good health, with no injuries or medical conditions requiring treatment. However, her behavioral assessment was concerning. She documented in her official report that King was displaying signs of severe depression and grief, including loss of appetite, refusal to engage in play, and what appeared to be suicidal ideation. The dog seemed to have lost the will to live. "This dog has experienced profound trauma," Dr. Williams told, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood animals at a deep level. He and Officer weren't just partners, they were family. That bond is as real and significant as any human relationship. King is grieving and he's grieving deeply. Nodded, his expression impassive. "What are our options?" he asked, though he likely already knew what the veterinarian would say. "We could try to work with him, try to rehabilitate him gradually," Dr. Williams suggested. "Give him time to process his grief. But honestly, Captain, King is 7 years old. He's bonded to one handler for his entire working life. The trauma of losing that handler combined with his age makes him unsuitable for reassignment. A new handler could try to work with him, but King would likely view it as a betrayal. The psychological damage could be irreversible. The most humane option would be to retire him." Process this information, his mind already moving through the departmental procedures and protocols. "Can he be adopted by a family?" he asked. Dr. Williams hesitated. "Not realistically. This is a working dog, not a pet. He's been trained for police work his entire life. His drive and training make him potentially dangerous in a family environment. He could be fine, but there's risk. Most departments have strict policies against placing retired police K-9s with private families." So the decision was made, the way bureaucratic decisions are often made, through a combination of established protocol, liability concerns, and the simple fact that institutions tend to follow the paths that have been laid out before them. The Memphis Police Department had a procedure for disposing of retired K-9 units who couldn't be adopted or rehabilitated. They could be euthanized humanely, or they could be auctioned off. The auction process provided a revenue stream for the K-9 unit budget, which pointed out could be used to train and equip new dogs, which would indirectly honor officers' legacy by continuing the important work of the K-9 unit. No one at the departmental meeting where this decision was made mentioned Sophie. No one thought about the 8-year-old girl who had lost her father and now was about to lose the only living creature that remembered him, the only being that shared the intimate memories of their family life. The decision-makers were professionals, bureaucrats following established procedures. They weren't evil or intentionally cruel. They were simply working within a system that had been designed without considering the human cost of its implementation. Captain drafted a formal memo documenting King's medical and behavioral status, along with the recommendation that King be prepared for auction. The memo was filed, copies were distributed, and an announcement was made to the K-9 unit that King would be sold to the highest bidder at the monthly police equipment auction scheduled for 3 weeks away. The proceeds from the sale, estimates suggested King could bring anywhere from $15,000 to $40,000, given his commendations and working record, would be allocated to the K-9 unit budget for training new dogs. When Jennifer received the phone call from the Memphis Police Department informing her of the auction, she was in her kitchen washing dishes from the girls' breakfast. The voice on the phone, a young officer named Martinez, was professional and efficient, delivering the information as if it were routine administrative business. "Mrs., I'm calling to inform you about the status of King, Officer's K-9 partner. The department has made the decision to auction King through our standard retirement procedure. The auction is scheduled for March 15th at the department's facility. We thought you'd want to know." Jennifer's hands went numb. She set the phone down carefully, unsure if she'd heard correctly. "I'm sorry, did you say auction?" she asked, her voice sounding strange and distant even to her own ears. "Yes, ma'am. It's standard procedure when a K-9 loses their handler. The dog can't be reassigned, and adoption isn't feasible given his training and age. The auction allows the department to recoup training costs and fund new K-9s. Is there anything else I can help you with?" Jennifer ended the call without responding. She stood in her kitchen, looking out the window at the backyard where Sophie and King had played together just weeks ago, and she wept. She wept for her daughter, who would now lose the last physical connection to her father. She wept for King, who had done nothing to deserve this fate. She wept for the cruelty of systems and procedures, for the way bureaucracy could render human suffering irrelevant. That evening when Sophie asked where King was, Jennifer couldn't bring herself to tell her the truth. Not yet. Not until she figured out what, if anything, could be done. The information about the auction began circulating through the police department's informal channels. Veteran officers who had known, who had seen him and King work together, who understood the depth of their bond, were deeply troubled by the decision. Some officers reached out quietly to Jennifer, offering condolences and expressing their dismay. One senior officer, Lieutenant Frank, who had been mentor and closest friend on the force, made a point of visiting the household to speak with Jennifer personally. "This isn't right," told Jennifer as they sat in her living room, drinking coffee. "I've seen a lot of things in this job, and I've never agreed with the way we handle retired K-9s. King deserves better. Sophie deserves better. There has to be something we can do." But what could be done? The department's decision had been made through official channels. King had been scheduled for auction. The wheels of bureaucracy were in motion, and it seemed impossible to stop them. Jennifer looked at with eyes filled with desperation, and she asked the question that would haunt her. "Is there any way to keep King from being sold?" Leaned back in his chair, thinking hard. "The only way would be if someone had enough money to outbid whoever comes to that auction," he said slowly. "But King will probably go for a lot of money. Security firms and other police departments will be bidding. It would take significant resources." That's when Jennifer made a decision that would change everything. She would tell Sophie the truth about the auction, about the 3-week deadline, about the slim possibility that they might be able to save King themselves. She had no idea how they would afford it, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let her daughter lose one more thing without a fight. Sophie discovered the truth by accident on a Tuesday evening, 3 days after the police department's formal announcement of the auction. She had been doing her homework at the kitchen table while her mother talked on the phone with her grandmother, Sophie's abuela, in the living room. The conversation had been quiet at first, but gradually Sophie's mother's voice had become more strained, more emotional. Sophie had learned over the past weeks to recognize the sounds of her mother's distress, the way her voice would crack, the pauses where she was trying not to cry. Curious and worried, Sophie had set down her pencil and crept toward the living room, positioning herself partially out of sight behind the doorframe. "The auction is in 3 weeks, Jennifer was saying, her voice trembling. "They're selling King like he's some kind of equipment instead of. I don't know how to tell Sophie. She's already lost so much. How do I explain to her that the last piece of is going to be sold to the highest bidder?" Sophie's heart stopped. The words didn't quite make sense at first, but as she pieced them together, the meaning became clear. King was going to be sold. Someone was going to buy him and take him away. Sophie's stomach twisted into knots, and she had to grip the doorframe to keep herself from falling. She crept back to the kitchen table and pretended to be working on her homework, but her mind was spinning, unable to focus on anything except the horrifying information she just overheard. That night, Sophie couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, her small mind working through the problem like a computer processing code. She had $87 in her piggy bank, money she'd accumulated over 3 years of birthdays, holidays, and small monetary gifts from relatives. She had no clear understanding of how much things cost in the real world, no comprehension of the economic realities that separated an 8-year-old girl's savings from the cost of a fully trained police dog. But what she did have was determination, and something deeper, a desperate need to hold onto the last tangible piece of her father, to keep King in her life, to prove that love and determination could overcome the cold machinery of institutional decisions. The next morning, Sophie approached her mother with a plan that was simultaneously heartbreaking and inspiring in its innocent determination. "Mom," she said, sitting at the breakfast table, her voice carrying a seriousness that seemed too advanced for an 8-year-old, "I want to buy King. I'm going to save money, and I'm going to buy him at the auction so he doesn't have to go away." Jennifer's first instinct was to gently explain the impossibility of the situation. She started to explain that King would probably cost a lot of money, more money than Sophie could possibly earn or save. But as she looked at her daughter's face, at the desperate hope and fierce determination in her eyes, Jennifer realized that her job wasn't to crush this dream, but to support it. Because perhaps this project, this mission, would give Sophie something to focus on besides grief. Perhaps the act of trying, of doing something concrete and purposeful in the face of loss, was exactly what Sophie needed. "Okay," Jennifer said softly. "If that's what you want to do, we'll figure it out together." Sophie threw herself into her mission with the singular focus that only a child can muster. She started doing chores around the house that she'd previously avoided, scrubbing the bathroom, vacuuming the living room, organizing the garage. Her mother began paying her small amounts for these tasks, amounts she'd never paid before, knowing that she was essentially funding her daughter's dream. But Sophie's entrepreneurial spirit didn't stop at household chores. She began knocking on neighbors' doors, offering to wash their cars for $5 per vehicle. She set up a lemonade stand on the corner of her street, strategically positioning it where people would see it. Mysteriously, the lemonade was terrible, too sweet, barely cold. The lemons cut unevenly, but people bought it anyway. They bought it at $5 a cup when the going rate for neighborhood lemonade was typically 50 cents. The neighbors knew about Sophie, had read about her in the local newspaper articles that had started circulating about Officer's death. They knew about her mission. They supported it in small ways, one cup of bad lemonade at a time. Sophie began walking dogs in the neighborhood for a small fee. She would carefully manage 3 or 4 dogs at a time, navigating the sidewalks with the concentration of someone managing a nuclear power plant. She was building something, penny by penny, dollar by dollar, and she never lost sight of her goal. She created a chart on her bedroom wall, decorated with markers and stickers, tracking her progress. Every dollar earned got a checkmark. Every $5 earned got a star. She drew pictures of King at the top of the chart, surrounded by hearts. Her grandmother, who had moved into the house temporarily to help Jennifer navigate her grief and manage household responsibilities, was deeply moved by Sophie's determination. Had lived through hardship in her own life, immigrating to the United States with nothing, building a life through sheer determination and hard work. She recognized something of herself in her granddaughter's resolve. Quietly, began adding money to Sophie's jar. She would slip bills into the pink envelope that Sophie kept in her backpack, $20 here, $50 there. She didn't make a show of it. She simply left the money for Sophie to discover, allowing her granddaughter to believe that her own efforts were the primary driver of her growing savings. Sophie's uncle, his younger brother David, who lived in Nashville and had been devastated by his brother's death, heard about Sophie's project and drove to Memphis on his weekend. He took Sophie out for ice cream and listened as she explained her plan with the gravity of someone planning a military operation. When he left that Sunday, he gave Sophie a check for $500. Sophie's eyes had widened to the size of dinner plates. She'd never seen a check before, had never understood what one represented. Her uncle explained that it was money, real money, that she could put toward her goal. Sophie had held that check like it was made of gold. By the second week, Sophie's mission had become known throughout her school. Teachers spoke about her determination in faculty meetings. Students asked her about King during lunch periods. Sophie found herself becoming an unwilling minor celebrity in her school community, though she was too focused on her goal to fully process this attention. She was running the numbers in her head constantly, trying to figure out how much King might cost, knowing that she needed more money than she currently had but not knowing how much more. Her mother had tried gently to explain that King might sell for $15,000 or more, and Sophie's face had gone pale. That was a number so large that it barely seemed real. But instead of giving up, Sophie had simply adjusted her strategy. If she needed more money, she would find more ways to earn it. She began asking neighbors if they had any odd jobs, organizing garage sales, helping paint fences, weeding gardens. She took on every task that was offered to her, working after school until the sun set, working on weekends until her hands were blistered and sore. Her mother worried about her, watching Sophie push herself so hard, understanding that this was Sophie's way of processing her grief, of refusing to accept loss as final. Jennifer didn't stop her daughter. Instead, she supported her, contributing money quietly, watching as Sophie's pink envelope grew thicker and heavier with the weight of coins and bills. By the time 3 weeks had passed and the auction date was approaching, Sophie had accumulated $3,847. It was an amount that would have been impossible without her family's support, but it was money that Sophie had worked for, had earned through her own effort and determination. She kept the money in the pink envelope, decorated with hearts and drawings of King, and she carried it everywhere with her, sleeping with it under her pillow some nights, running her fingers over the envelope during quiet moments, whispering promises to the money and to King that everything would work out, that her love and determination would be enough to keep her father's partner in her life. The morning of March 15th dawned gray and cold, with a threat of rain hanging in the Memphis sky like an ominous prediction. Sophie woke before sunrise, her heart pounding with a combination of hope and terror. This was the day that would determine King's future, and in many ways her own. She dressed carefully in a pink dress that her mother had helped her pick out, wanting to look nice, wanting to feel brave. She tucked the pink envelope containing $3,847 into her backpack, alongside a notebook where she'd written down her maximum bid amount and practiced saying it out loud. She'd rehearsed what she would do if she won, how she would walk to the front to claim King, how she would lead him out of the auction facility and into their waiting car. Jennifer had taken the day off work, understanding that this moment was significant beyond measure. She'd arranged for to stay home with Sophie's younger cousins who were staying with them temporarily. The drive to the Memphis Police Department's auction facility took 20 minutes, and neither Jennifer nor Sophie spoke much during that time. Sophie stared out the window, her small hands clenching and unclenching nervously. Jennifer reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand, offering silent support, though her own stomach was twisted into knots. The auction facility was housed in a large, industrial-style building on the outskirts of Memphis. When Sophie and Jennifer arrived, there were already dozens of people milling around: professional handlers from security firms, representatives from police departments in neighboring counties, private trainers, and a handful of curious civilians who had heard about the auction through word of mouth. The atmosphere was businesslike and professional, nothing like the emotional significance that the event held for Sophie. King was kept in a secure kennel area in the back of the facility. Sophie didn't get to see him before the auction began, which was part of the protocol. The organizers wanted to minimize distractions and emotional reactions. Sophie and Jennifer took seats in the back of the auction house, away from the main crowd of bidders. Sophie felt very small sitting in the large chair, her feet dangling slightly above the floor. She clutched her backpack to her chest like it was a life preserver. The auction began promptly at 10:00 a.m. Various items were auctioned off first: police equipment, seized property, and several retired police vehicles. Sophie barely paid attention to any of it. Her focus was entirely on waiting for King to be brought out. When it finally happened at approximately 10:47 a.m., Sophie's breath caught in her throat. King was led out by Officer James, the same officer who had retrieved him from his police cruiser on that terrible night. The dog had been groomed and cleaned, his coat gleaming under the fluorescent lights of the facility. But Sophie could see the sadness in King's eyes, could sense the way his spirit seemed diminished. He moved slowly, mechanically, not the vibrant, energetic dog she remembered. King's medical and service records were displayed on a large screen, highlighting his commendations, his successful cases, his value as a trained police animal. The auctioneer, a man named Robert, no relation to Sophie's family, began the bidding at $5,000. Hands shot up immediately. This was a valuable animal, and there was significant interest in acquiring him. $8,000, $10,000, $12,000. Sophie's stomach was dropping with increment increment. Her $3,847 suddenly seemed impossibly small, like trying to stop an avalanche with a handful of sand. $15,000. A representative from a private security firm in Nashville was bidding aggressively. $18,000. Another bidder, this one from a police department in Arkansas, was competing. $22,000. The price was escalating rapidly, and Sophie felt tears beginning to stream down her face. Her mother wrapped an arm around her, understanding that the situation was slipping out of their grasp. $28,000. $32,000, $35,000. Sophie wanted to raise her hand, wanted to bid, but she knew with absolute certainty that her money wasn't going to be enough. The professional bidders had resources that she couldn't compete with. They were bidding not with emotion but with calculations about return on investment and asset value. They weren't bidding for love, they were bidding for utility. $38,000, $40,000. A man in the third row, representing a private security firm from Atlanta, had taken over as the primary bidder. He seemed determined to win King, nodding confidently each time the auctioneer called out a new number. Sophie's tears were flowing freely now, and her mother was holding her close, whispering comfort that neither of them really believed in. It was at this moment, at 10:58 a.m., that something extraordinary happened. A woman in the audience stood up. She was a local news reporter named Lisa Martinez, someone who had covered Officer's funeral and had been moved by the story. She had spent the past 3 weeks researching Sophie's mission, learning about the little girl who was trying to save her father's dog. She had scheduled this day off specifically to attend the auction, though not to bid. She was there to document the story, to capture the moment, to bear witness. But as she watched Sophie's heart breaking in real time, as she observed the little girl's desperate hope transforming into crushing disappointment, Lisa made an impulsive decision. She raised her phone and began filming. Not the auction, but Sophie, capturing her tears, her heartbreak, her love for King. And then Lisa stepped forward and approached the auctioneer, whispering something in his ear. The auctioneer paused. He looked at Lisa, then at Sophie, then back at Lisa. He nodded slowly. "We're going to take a brief pause in the bidding," the auctioneer announced, his voice carrying an unusual tone of emotion. "We have a situation here that I think everyone needs to understand." Lisa turned to face the audience and she began to speak. "This little girl," she said, gesturing towards Sophie, "is Sophie. Her father was officer who was killed in the line of duty 6 weeks ago. This dog, King, was her father's partner for 7 years. The Memphis Police Department has scheduled King for auction today, following standard protocol. But what most of you don't know is that this 8-year-old girl has spent the last 3 weeks working, doing chores, walking dogs, selling lemonade, doing whatever she could to save enough money to buy King and keep him in her family. She's raised $3,847. She's here today hoping to bid on the dog that represents her last connection to her father." The auction facility fell completely silent. All eyes turned towards Sophie, who looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Jennifer pulled her daughter closer, protective and supportive simultaneously. "I think," Lisa continued, "that before we continue this auction, everyone here should know that they're bidding against an 8-year-old girl who's trying to keep her father's memory alive through this dog. I think everyone deserves to make an informed decision about whether they really need to spend $40,000 on this animal, or whether there might be something more important happening here." The Atlanta security firm representative lowered his hand. He looked at Sophie, understanding what she represented, and he simply shook his head. "I'm out," he announced quietly. No one else raised their hand either. The auction had transformed from a simple transaction into something sacred, something that transcended the normal rules of business and economics. The auctioneer looked at his clipboard, then back at the room full of people who were no longer interested in bidding. "It appears," the auctioneer said slowly, "that we have a new situation on our hands. I think we need to take this to the Memphis Police Department administration. This is no longer a standard auction." Sophie didn't understand what was happening. She only knew that somehow, someway, something had shifted. Lisa Martinez had placed her phone down and was looking directly at Sophie with tears in her own eyes. And that was when Sophie's life changed forever, though she wouldn't fully comprehend it until much later. Lisa Martinez left the auction facility at 11:15 a.m. with her phone containing footage of Sophie's face, her tears, her desperate hope colliding with devastating disappointment. She drove directly to the television station where she worked as a field reporter for WREG News Channel 3, one of Memphis's largest news outlets. Her hands were shaking as she transferred the video to her computer and began editing it. She didn't add dramatic music or embellishments. The story didn't need them. The raw footage of an 8-year-old girl's heartbreak was powerful enough on its own. Lisa wrote the accompanying script carefully, choosing her words with precision. She included information about Officer's sacrifice, about the Memphis Police Department's protocol that mandated the auction, about Sophie's 3-week mission to save her father's partner. She included her own commentary about what she'd witnessed at the auction, about the moment when an entire room of adults had stopped competing for a dog once they understood what that dog truly represented to one small girl. The station manager, a woman named Williams, watched the footage twice. By the end of the second viewing, she had tears streaming down her face. "This airs on the evening news," she said firmly, "and I want it featured prominently. This is exactly the kind of story that people need to hear." The piece aired at 6:00 p.m. on WREG News Channel 3. It was 2 minutes and 43 seconds long, a significant block of time for a local news segment. The headline read, "8-year-old daughter of fallen officer fights to keep her father's K9 partner." The footage cut between Sophie's face at the auction, officer's funeral procession, King sitting in his kennel, and Lisa's narration of the story. By 6:47 p.m., less than an hour after the segment aired, the station's phones were ringing continuously. By 7:00 p.m., their website had crashed from the traffic overload. The video was uploaded to YouTube by an unknown user, and by midnight it had been shared to Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Tik, and by 2:00 a.m. it had over 500,000 views. By 6:00 a.m. the next morning, it had 2 million views. News outlets across Tennessee were picking up the story. By noon on March 16th, national news networks were covering it. CNN had a segment. Fox News ran it. MSNBC discussed the story with commentary about law enforcement, sacrifice, and the bonds between handlers and their K9 partners. The Internet's collective heart had been captured by Sophie's story. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 12 hours of the video going viral, a GoFundMe page was created by an anonymous user with the title "Help Sophie Save Her Father's K9 Partner, King." The initial fundraising goal was set at $50,000. Within 48 hours, the page had exceeded $50,000. Within 1 week, it had raised over $200,000. Donations were pouring in from all across the United States, and even from Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom. A teacher from California donated $100 with a note that read, "Your father was a hero. King is a hero. You're a hero for fighting for him." A firefighter from New York donated $500 with a message, "My K9 partner died last year. This story is for him." An NFL player who had grown up in a police family donated $2,500 and posted about Sophie's story on his social media accounts, which had millions of followers. That single post generated thousands of additional donations. A CEO of a major technology company donated $10,000, along with a personal message to Sophie explaining how her courage had reminded him why he believed in the power of love and loyalty. Business owners, teachers, nurses, construction workers, lawyers, stay-at-home mothers, elderly retirees, people from every walk of life were moved by Sophie's story and contributing what they could. The Memphis Police Department's social media pages were flooded with comments from law enforcement officers across the country. K9 handlers shared stories of their own dogs, of the bonds they shared, of how losing a partner affected them. Police chiefs from other departments called the Memphis Police Department leadership, expressing their support for Sophie and their own recognition of how profound the human-dog bond truly was. Local Memphis businesses began jumping on board. A local restaurant chain donated $5,000 and started a fundraiser where a percentage of each meal sold would go toward the King Fund. A local car dealership created a matching donation program, matching up to $20,000 of customer purchases. A construction company pledged to donate $1,000 per week for the next 2 months. News crews began showing up at Sophie's school, at her home, at parks where she would go. The family had to hire a security specialist to help manage the media attention and protect their privacy. Jennifer found herself giving interviews to national news outlets, telling her story, discussing her husband's sacrifice and her daughter's remarkable courage. Sophie's classmates started a club at school dedicated to helping the K9 unit. They organized a bake sale that raised $3,000. Her teachers incorporated her story into lessons about perseverance, grief, loss, and community. Sophie became somewhat against her will, a symbol of hope and determination for an entire community and beyond. By March 19th, just 4 days after the auction, the Memphis Police Department received a letter from the mayor's office. The mayor requested a meeting with Police Chief James Sterling to discuss the situation with officers K-9 partner and the exceptional community response. Chief Sterling, who had initially been dismissive of the idea that the auction might be handled differently, was now receiving calls from city council members, the governor's office, and national media outlets. The political and social pressure had become impossible to ignore. The police union also weighed in. The Memphis Police Officers Association issued a statement expressing their belief that King should remain with the family. They pointed out that the department's protocol, while standard, didn't account for situations where the fallen officer's family desired to care for the retired K-9. They suggested that the department could donate King to the family as a gesture of support and honor to officer's legacy. Captain David, the K-9 unit commander who had made the original decision to auction King, found himself under intense scrutiny. He received hate mail from animal lovers, messages from officers questioning his judgment, and pressure from his superiors to reconsider the decision. A man who had prided himself on following protocol and making decisions based on efficiency rather than emotion, found himself confronted with the reality that systems and procedures, while necessary, sometimes failed to account for human dignity and need. On March 20th, Captain made a statement to the press. He acknowledged that the department's standard protocol, while designed to be fair and provide for the retirement of K-9 units, may not have been appropriate in this particular situation. He announced that the Memphis Police Department would be working with the family to ensure that King remained with them. He expressed admiration for Sophie's determination and acknowledged the community's overwhelming response. Chief Sterling, in a press conference held at police headquarters, announced that the Memphis Police Department would be making an exception to their standard K-9 retirement protocol. King would be donated to the family, with full veterinary care and support provided by the department for the remainder of the dog's life. Furthermore, the department would be establishing a new policy. Whenever a K-9 loses its handler, the department would prioritize the wishes of the handler's family before pursuing other options for the dog's future. The decision was met with standing ovations from law enforcement communities across the country. The police union praised the department's compassion. Social media erupted with celebration. The GoFundMe page, which had raised over $250,000, would now have its proceeds redirected to establish a fund in officers' name to support police families and retired K-9 units. Sophie, sitting in her school classroom when she heard the news, couldn't quite process what was happening. She raised her hand and asked her teacher if she could make a phone call. The teacher granted permission and Sophie called her mother. "Mom," she said when Jennifer answered, "is it true? Does King get to stay with us?" Jennifer, who was crying with joy and relief, confirmed that it was true. King was coming home. The day of King's homecoming was set for March 28th, exactly 6 weeks after Officer's death. The Memphis Police Department organized an official ceremony, transforming it from a simple transfer of property into something sacred, a public acknowledgement of sacrifice, of love, of the profound bonds that transcend the boundaries between species. The event was held at the Memphis Police Department's main headquarters on South Main Street, with the ceremony scheduled for 2:00 p.m. News of the ceremony had spread, and hundreds of people began gathering outside the police station hours before the event was scheduled to begin. Officers in uniform stood at attention. Members of officers' family arrived wearing black ribbons in his honor. Community members who had followed Sophie's story online came in person to witness the moment. News trucks from every major local outlet were parked outside the building. Satellite dishes pointed toward the gray March sky. National news networks had sent representatives as well. This story had captured the imagination of a nation tired of divisive headlines and desperate for a moment of human connection and triumph. Sophie dressed carefully that morning, her hands trembling as she selected her outfit. She chose to wear the same pink dress she'd worn to the auction, the dress that had become intertwined with her mission and her memories. Her mother helped her brush her hair, braiding it carefully, making sure every detail was perfect. Jennifer's eyes were red from crying, not tears of sadness, but tears of complicated emotion, grief for her husband, pride in her daughter, overwhelming gratitude for her community's support, and profound anticipation for the moment when Sophie would finally be reunited with King. Prepared Sophie's favorite breakfast, pancakes with strawberries and whipped cream, but Sophie could barely eat. Her stomach was twisted into knots of anxiety and hope. She kept asking her mother questions. Would King remember her? Would he be okay? What if something went wrong? Jennifer answered each question with patience and reassurance, though she was experiencing her own internal turbulence. When they arrived at the police station at 1:30 p.m., Sophie's breath was taken away by the sight of the crowd. Hundreds of people, police officers from multiple departments, her classmates from school, her teachers, neighbors, strangers who cared, took Sophie's hand firmly, anchoring her as they were escorted through the crowd toward the main entrance of the station. The ceremony took place in the police station's main conference room, a large space that had been decorated with photographs of officer, images of him and King working together, and American flags. The room could hold approximately 300 people, and it was packed to capacity. Chief James Sterling stood at a podium, addressing the crowd. He spoke about Officer's 23 years of service, about his dedication to the Memphis Police Department, about his sacrifice. He spoke about King, about the remarkable bond between the officer and his K-9 partner. He spoke about Sophie, about the courage of an 8-year-old girl who refused to accept loss as final, who fought for what she loved with a determination that inspired an entire nation. Officer embodied the values that this department stands for, Chief Sterling said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine emotion. Courage, dedication, sacrifice. And today we honor his memory not with ceremonies or monuments, though those are important. Today we honor his memory by ensuring that the one living creature who shared his daily life, who knew him intimately, who loved him unconditionally, gets to remain with his family. King is not just a retired police dog. King is a member of the family, and he belongs with them. Officers stood at attention as the chief spoke. Some were openly crying. The community members in attendance were silent, transfixed by the moment's significance. Then came the part everyone had been waiting for. Officer James emerged from a side door, and King walked beside him on a leash. The dog looked different than he had at the auction. His coat gleamed, his eyes were brighter, and there was a vitality about him that suggested he somehow knew something significant was about to happen. The crowd gasped collectively. Cameras clicked. News crews captured every moment. Chief Sterling looked directly at Sophie and extended his hand toward her. "Sophie, would you come up here?" he asked gently. Sophie looked at her mother, who nodded encouragingly. With her grandmother's hand still holding hers, Sophie walked toward the podium. She was small, so small, moving through a sea of adults, her pink dress bright against the somber uniforms. When she reached Chief Sterling, he bent down and placed King's leash in her small hands. "King belongs with you now, Sophie," he said softly. "He's yours to love and care for. Your father would be very proud of you." Sophie's hands closed around the leash, and for a moment she didn't move. She simply stood there, holding the physical connection to her father, to the partnership that had defined so much of her early childhood. Then King recognized her. The dog's entire demeanor transformed. His tail, which had been still and passive, began to wag. His ears perked up. He pressed his massive head against Sophie's body, and that was when the dam broke. Sophie collapsed into King, her small arms wrapping around his neck, and she sobbed. Not tears of sadness, but tears of overwhelming relief, of reunion, of survival. She had fought for this moment with everything she had, and here it was, finally, impossibly, miraculously real. King's tongue licked at her face, and he made small whimpering sounds, sounds that spoke to his own recognition of his place in the world again, his place in this family. The entire room erupted into applause. Officers wiped away tears. Community members cheered. News cameras captured the moment. A little girl and a German shepherd, reunited, celebrating their love and their survival of tragedy. It was the kind of moment that transcended typical news coverage. It was the kind of moment that people would remember for the rest of their lives. For 10 full minutes, Sophie and King held each other while the world applauded around them. Jennifer climbed up to her daughter and wrapped her arms around both Sophie and King, creating a trinity of love and survival. Stood nearby, her hands pressed to her heart, tears streaming down her weathered face. When Sophie finally stood up, King remained pressed against her leg, unwilling to let her out of his sight. Sophie looked toward Chief Sterling, and with the gravity and eloquence that had become her hallmark, she said simply, "Thank you for giving me my dad back." The chief knelt down to be eye level with Sophie. "Your father was my friend," he said. "He was a wonderful officer and an even better man. I have no doubt that he's watching this moment, and I have no doubt that he's so very proud of you." The ceremony concluded with a formal presentation, a framed photograph of Officer and King, which was hung on the wall of the Memphis Police Department's K-9 unit office. A bronze plaque was installed beneath the photograph, reading, "Officer honored in service and sacrifice. May his legacy live through those he loved." As Sophie, King, and Jennifer left the police station that afternoon, the crowd parted for them like a sea. People reached out to touch King, to pat Sophie on the shoulder, to offer words of encouragement and support. Camera flashes lit up the gray afternoon. Reporters shouted questions, but the family didn't stop to answer. They simply continued forward, moving toward their car, moving toward home, moving toward a future that suddenly seemed filled with possibility rather than despair. When they arrived home, Sophie took King directly to the backyard, the same backyard where she and her father had played with King countless times. She sat on the grass, and King sprawled across her lap, his massive frame somehow fitting perfectly against her small body. For hours they sat together in the fading light of the afternoon, reunited together, finally home. 6 months after the auction that never took place, on a warm September morning, Sophie and King had settled into a new rhythm of life that bore little resemblance to the chaos and grief of the previous months. The house on Cypress Avenue, which had felt hollow and incomplete after Officer's death, had transformed into a home again. King had reclaimed his place beneath the dinner table. Sophie had learned to smile without guilt, to laugh without feeling like she was betraying her father's memory. Life, that complicated and resilient force, had found a way to continue, to adapt, to flourish even in the presence of profound loss. Sophie's morning ritual had evolved into something beautiful and purposeful. She would wake at 6 o'clock, pull on her clothes, and take King for their morning walk through the Memphis neighborhood. The route had become predictable, down Cypress, left on Madison, around the small park where children now played safely, thanks in part to increased police presence that had followed Officer's death. The walk served multiple purposes. It gave King the exercise and mental stimulation he needed. It gave Sophie quiet time to think and process her grief. And it gave the community a daily reminder of the story that had captured their hearts. Along the route, something remarkable had developed. Neighbors had begun to recognize them. Not just recognize, but celebrate them. Mrs. Henderson from the corner house would wave from her porch and often bring out treats for King. The Martinez family, no relation to the news reporter, would come outside specifically to greet Sophie and King. Local business owners would comment when Sophie and King passed by. The community had adopted the story as their own, and Sophie and King had become something akin to neighborhood ambassadors, daily reminders of resilience, courage, and the power of community to heal. Jennifer had discovered a new purpose in her grief. She had become deeply involved in advocating for police families, and for changes in how law enforcement departments handled K-9 retirements. She gave speeches at police conferences, sharing her family's story, emphasizing the importance of considering the emotional and relational needs of officers' families when retiring working dogs. The Memphis Police Department, following their commitment to the new policy established after Sophie's story went viral, had begun implementing protocols that prioritized family wishes before pursuing auction or other disposition methods. Jennifer's advocacy had inspired other police departments across the country to reconsider their own K-9 retirement protocols. Sophie's grandmother had taken on a quasi-official role as King's primary caregiver during the day when Sophie was at school and Jennifer was at work. The elderly woman had formed her own bond with the dog, spending hours in the backyard with King, talking to him in Spanish, sharing with him the wisdom accumulated over 73 years of life. King seemed to understand that was part of the family unit, and he provided her with companionship that filled some of the loneliness she'd experienced since her husband's death years earlier. Sophie's relationship with school had transformed as well. She had become something of a celebrity among her third-grade classmates, though not in a way that isolated her or made her uncomfortable. Rather, her classmates seemed to have internalized the lessons of her story, that determination mattered, that love could overcome obstacles, that speaking up about injustice was important. A club had formed at her school called the King Squad, dedicated to animal welfare and community service. The group had organized fundraisers that raised over $50,000, which they donated to various animal shelters and K-9 units across Tennessee. Sophie's teacher, Mrs., had incorporated Sophie's story into the curriculum in thoughtful and age-appropriate ways. Students learned about perseverance through literature that explored themes of determination and overcoming obstacles. They studied the municipal government and how police departments operated. They learned about grief and loss in ways that normalized these difficult emotions rather than avoiding them. Mrs. had found that Sophie's presence in the classroom had elevated the entire learning environment, creating a community of young people who understood that their individual actions mattered, and that standing up for what was right was a fundamental responsibility. The Memphis Police Department had created the Memorial K-9 Fund, which had accumulated over $280,000 from the GoFundMe campaign and subsequent community donations. The fund was used to support police families who had lost loved ones in the line of duty, to provide financial assistance for K-9 medical care, and to fund training programs that emphasized the emotional well-being of K-9 units and their handlers. Captain David had become the fund's administrator, viewing this role as a way to honor both officers' memory and the profound lesson he had learned about the importance of considering human emotion in institutional decision-making. King's health had improved dramatically during the 6 months since his homecoming. The depression that had plagued him at the police kennels had lifted. He had regained weight, his coat was lustrous and healthy, and his eyes had regained the spark that had made him such a remarkable police dog. The veterinary team that monitored King's health reported that his physical transformation was matched by an emotional transformation. The dog seemed to have recovered his will to live, his joy in existence, his understanding that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. But King was aging. He was now 7.5 years old, nearing the end of what would be a natural for a German Shepherd. Sophie had been gently prepared by her mother for the reality that King wouldn't be with the family forever, that death was part of life's cycle, that grief was the price of love. Rather than causing despair, this awareness had deepened Sophie's appreciation for each day with King, had made her more intentional about spending time with him, had taught her profound lessons about mortality and presence that most children her age were not equipped to understand. Sophie had begun giving talks at schools and community centers about her experience, about her father's sacrifice, about King's loyalty. She had been invited to speak at the Memphis Police Academy, where she addressed officers who were preparing for their own K-9 assignments. She told them about the bond she'd witnessed between her father and King, about how that bond extended beyond the working relationship into something deeper and more meaningful. Several officers had approached her afterward with tears in their eyes, telling her that her words had changed how they thought about their K-9 partners, had made them understand that the dogs weren't simply working animals but family members with their own emotional needs and capacity for love. A children's book had been published, titled Sophie and King, a story of love that couldn't break. Sophie had worked with an author and illustrator to create a narrative of her experience, written in a way that was accessible to young readers while maintaining the emotional truth of the story. All proceeds from the book's sales went directly to the Memorial K-9 Fund. The book had become a bestseller in the children's literature category, and Sophie received letters from children across the country who had read it and been inspired by her courage. On the 6-month anniversary of King's homecoming, the Memphis Police Department organized a small, intimate gathering at the police station. Chief Sterling presented Sophie with a framed photograph of her father and King, along with a commendation recognizing her extraordinary courage and unwavering determination. Sophie accepted the award graciously, speaking briefly about how she missed her father every single day, but how King helped her feel connected to him, how having King in her life meant that a part of her father was still present. As summer turned into autumn, Sophie continued her morning walks with King, continued attending school, continued processing her grief and celebrating her survival. She had learned, at an age when most children were still primarily concerned with playground politics and homework, that life could be devastatingly unfair and crushingly painful. But she had also learned that love was stronger than loss, that community could heal even the deepest wounds, that determination and faith could move mountains, or in her case, could save a dog and honor a fallen hero. Officer's legacy lived not in medals or commendations gathering dust in filing cabinets, but in his daughter's heart, in King's loyal eyes, in the changed policies of police departments across the nation, in the children reading Sophie's story and learning about courage, in the community of Memphis that had come together to support a grieving family. Every morning when Sophie clipped the leash onto King's collar and stepped out into the Memphis sunshine, she was honoring her father, celebrating her survival and proving that love, fierce, determined, unbreakable love, was the most powerful force in the universe.